Hi folks, my name is Penny Wyatt and I'm in charge of the JIRA and Service Desk QA teams at Atlassian. I've been working here for just under 5 years. Before that, I spent 7 years as a developer, a dev in testing, and a tester. Today we're going to talk about the JIRA development process. So on JIRA, we've got roughly 70 developers spread across 3 countries. These are pretty amazing people, and they ship high-quality releases every 2 weeks to our customers. Now, if we were following traditional quality assurance practices, in order to achieve this, we'd need an equally large testing team. But instead, what we have is a QA team of just 6 people. Today I'm going to cover 2 topics. The first is why. Why do we believe that having such a small QA team gives us higher quality and faster speed? And then I'm going to talk about how we've achieved this in practice in the JIRA team, and hopefully give you some ideas to take away. So let's start with quality at speed. Speed, scope, and quality. I'm sure you've seen this triangle of trade-offs in some form or other. More often it's time instead of speed, and often cost is included as well. But the underlying assumption is often taken for granted, that if you want to ship faster, you need to trade off either scope or quality or both. Now, scope is easier to define and measure. You can have a checklist of features. Whilst quality, well, it's more of a sliding scale, it's more a matter of perception. So very often it's quality that gets cut when a team wants to increase their speed. Now the way that this looks in practice is like this. So in Waterfall teams, you have developers writing the code. When they're done, they pass it to the testers who test it. They find issues, they pass it back to the devs who fix the bugs. There's a bit of bouncing back and forth during that time, finding more bugs, introducing new bugs. But eventually the product gets to a quality level that is acceptable to ship. At that point, a release is cut and the features shipped to the customers. When the team decides to trade off quality and speed, then that release bar gets moved earlier, so not all the bugs are fixed before it's released. If you're really unlucky, you can end up in this kind of situation where you do your development and then you ship. No time for bug fix. Now in Agile teams, it's slightly different. So ideally, testing and development and bug fixing is all carried out in parallel. So this means that you fix the bugs as you create them. This means that if you ship early, you tend to cut scope rather than quality, because the development work isn't fully started until the end of the process. Or at least in theory. But if you're not diligent, you can easily end up in a situation where all the easy development work is done up front, everything's done to an 80% level, you get a pile of bugs created, pushed forward to some kind of hardening or polishing phase later on. And then what a surprise, your release bar comes back and there you are shipping poor quality features again. So at Atlassian, none of those options really sounded that appealing to us. Even in that best case Agile model, where you're fixing your bugs as you go along, there's an awful lot of development time being spent on rework and bug fix rather than on development. So we took a step back and asked, why do we even have this trade-off at all? And we decided that all 3 of these models are built on the assumption that developers will write code incorrectly the first time, then hand it to somebody who'll point out the problems with it, who'll hand it back, and then they'll fix it. And so the root cause of the issue here, as we see it, is that the skills of building something and knowing if what you've built is any good belong to 2 different classes of people. Because if your developers were also all skilled testers, your dev process would look like this and you wouldn't have that trade-off. You would build it correctly the first time, the testing would be small, efficient, done as part of the dev in a loop rather than a separate activity. You'd build it correctly and then you'd ship it. End of story. So why aren't most software teams working this way? Worse, why aren't most software teams even trying to work this way? Well, let's be honest. The reason that most non-startup teams do have testers is because very many developers aren't any good at testing. Good testing's a skill, it's a mindset. You don't get that for free when you get your diploma in development. And so if you don't have that good testing skill on your team, then you're going to be shipping poor quality. And so teams tend to hire testers to ensure that. Now, in teams that don't have testers, generally startup teams or small agile teams, often the developers are responsible for testing, but they don't have the skills to go with that responsibility. So they focus on doing what they know best, which is writing automation. Very often, since they've learnt these testing skills from other developers, they don't even know that they're poor at testing because they've never seen anybody do it any better. So how did this happen? Well, back in the 60s, there was an episode of Star Trek in which a transporter accident split Captain Kirk into two different people. One of them was nice but indecisive, the other one was evil but effective. Now, as one person with both of these combined, he was a decisive but moral captain. As two half people, each with half his personality, they caused disasters. So they fought with each other, they fought with other people, they put the ship at risk. Now, my theory is that one day, at a similar time period, a similar accident caused an engineer to split into two, a dev and a tester half. Each half only held half the skills that they needed in order to create great software. So after being released from sickbay, the dev half went back to work in engineering. But without the tester half of their personality, things weren't quite the same. So first of all, they lost their quality mindset. They started giving excuses for delivering exactly what was written in the spec, rather than caring about what their customers needed and ensuring that what they were building was meeting that. Then they lost their testing skills. They started believing that automation could provide the full quality picture, that their local dev environment was the same as production, and they only started testing small parts in isolation because that's all they were told that they were responsible for. And finally, they lost their knowledge of all the amazing ways that the product can be configured by customers, of security and performance, of platform risks, and they stopped learning from mistakes that other people had made. Now, in desperation, the chief engineer went and found the tester half, who was out wandering the corridors, and put them to work side by side with their developer half. But having two people working like this wasn't the same as them being one person. Now they had conflicting goals, conflicting mindsets, and so they spent their days bouncing poor quality features back and forth between them. Now, over time, these dev and tester half engineers each taught these half skill sets to other people, and this inefficient way of working became the norm. So is there hope for the future of software development? Can these two halves be put back through the transporter and reintegrated into whole engineers again? Well, the good news is that these problems are all fixable. So the mindset of an engineer can be affected by the culture of the team in which they're working. Lack of skills, lack of knowledge, both of these can be fixed through education. And so with a team of these reintegrated engineers, you can throw that speed versus quality trade-off out of the airlock and get away with having both. And so this is where quality assistance comes in. So at Atlassian, we have no quality assurance team, we have no testers. Instead, we have a quality assistance team. And as quality assistants, we have two main goals. So our short-term activities are aimed at protecting and delighting our customers. So making sure that every feature that's delivered is delivered to the level of quality that we require. But everything we do in the short term is also progressing our long-term goals, getting us closer to a world where our devs are all expert testers and don't need us at all. Now, balancing these two goals can be a difficult art, but later in the presentation, I'll take you through the process we've followed thus far. But for now, you might be feeling pretty skeptical about this whole idea. And I'll be honest with you, when I joined Atlassian 5 years ago, I didn't believe this would work. I mean, we didn't know any other company that did it. We had no idea how we were going to achieve it. But it just sounded like a good idea. I had worked with developers that were top of the industry and still had no idea about testing. And so I believed that it was impossible for developers to learn how to test well. I thought that developers and testers were just completely different types of people. That said, we gave it a try anyway. We experimented. Sometimes we succeeded, sometimes we failed. But with every step, every new thing we tried, we got closer to that ideal of escaping the cycle of bug fix and rework. Now, a lot of metrics when it comes to quality are useless or misleading. But the one metric that I have found that's been consistently useful in JIRA has been that of story rejection rate. So that is the percentage of stories that have to return to the original developer for rework or bug fixing. Now, when we first introduced quality assistance into the JIRA team, the rejection rate was roughly 100%. So that doesn't mean that everything was broken, but it means that every story had at least one issue with it. Maybe it was functionally correct, but it had a security hole, or an issue with one browser in one particular case. But over time, as we've worked through this quality assistance model, we've changed the mindset, skills, and knowledge of our devs. This rejection rate has plummeted. And the best that we've seen now is 4% across a whole JIRA release, across the whole JIRA team. So that means that 96% of development work in that release was done to production quality standards before it left the original developer's hands. That's before code review, internal use of JIRA, soaking demos, or any of the other safety nets that we have in place. 96% of stories were at production quality before they left the first person to write them. So how did we go about changing the culture of the JIRA team to make this happen? Initially, JIRA had no QA. The devs were doing all of their own testing. However, they didn't really know anything about good testing techniques such as exploratory testing. They focused entirely on writing automation. Now, don't get me wrong, automation is critically important for regression testing. It's still a very, very strong part of our quality puzzle. But automation only really tells you whether your code is functionally correct for the scenarios that you think to code for. So it doesn't tell you about security, perceived performance, usability, concurrency, robustness, or any other aspect of quality that can't be defined in a checklist. So the first thing that we needed to do was to show them that there was more to quality than just automation. So we started by pitching in alongside the devs and doing hands-on exploratory testing. And we quickly proved to them that exploratory testing could catch whole classes of issues that automation could not. Now, after countless occasions where we saved the devs bacon because they were about to ship horrible bugs and we caught them, we found that we had their attention and respect. They started realizing that, yes, we do actually know what we're talking about when we say we're testing experts. So having proven the value of exploratory testing to the devs, we then started to break down this line and ask devs to start trying it too. We did this by establishing what we call dotting, or developer on testing. So the devs would take turns to do exploratory testing of each other's work. Now, as they were still new at this, QA would still take the highest risk stories to test. And we would also do some release level testing to look for issues that the dots had missed. What we found was we were still finding way too many issues in our release level testing stage. It was clear to us that the dots really didn't know how to do exploratory testing well, and far too many issues were slipping through dotting. And so in the spirit of experimentation, we tried something different. We said, okay, from now on, we're going to really invest in dotting. Now dots will test every story, and we will spend our time giving you more guidance on how to do it well. So at this stage, we introduced what we called QA demos. That is, a quick pairing session between the dev and the tester after implementation is finished. So the dev and the QA discuss the feature, they talk about the implementation, they talk about the risks, they have a look at the code, and they talk about the testing that the dev's already done. This is not a testing session, it's only a 15 or 30-minute discussion. But based on this discussion, the QA has a pretty good idea of what testing they would do if they were going to test it themselves. They have an idea what the risks are, they have an idea what the trouble points might be. But instead of doing the testing themselves, they write testing notes, which is advice for the DOT on what they should consider when they're doing their exploratory testing. Now, the critical thing about testing notes is that they're not checklists and they're not scripted tests, because both of these serve to limit exploration and critical thinking. Instead, these are open questions, prompts and hints, tips to get the DOT thinking critically and exploring, rather than looking to us to do their thinking for them. And we found that once we had these testing notes in place, the quality of dotting rose dramatically. And in fact, after 6 months passed without us finding any issues in release level testing, we dropped the release level testing safety net completely. It was pretty much just a waste of time. So now we had the quality consistently higher, so we started looking at improving speed. At this point, we still had a rejection rate of roughly 30% for stories. And as we looked into that, we found that we could very often predict a rejection before the feature was even written. So for example, we'd know that a particular developer would never bother testing session timeouts. We'd mention that in the testing notes, the DOT would test it and reject it because session timeouts weren't handled. As we sat back and had a look at that, we realised it was ridiculous. We were giving the advice to the wrong person. So we started pairing with the devs before they started their work, giving this information about risks and testing advice to them rather than to the DOT. We called these QA kickoffs, and we now do them before every story is started. This way, many of the bugs were never even implemented in the first place, and the rejection rate halved to 15% just from QA kickoffs alone. So that was pretty good. We were pretty happy with that. But remember that we've still got this long-term goal of teaching the devs to do this critical thinking themselves and to not need us. So after a while, our devs got into the habit of doing kickoffs with QA. They started anticipating what we were going to ask. They started getting bored. And that's fantastic. Once we notice that a dev is getting to that point, we say, great, now we'd like you to do your own kickoffs by yourself, write up your own initial testing notes, the results of that kickoff, and we'll review it and add anything you missed. So that way the dev has more ownership over their quality mindset and over the quality of the feature. But we're still there to protect our customers if the dev is still learning or has a mental blank. Now at this point we did some more analysis and found that the very presence of the dotting safety net was causing bugs further upstream. So the devs were very good at dotting each other's features, but when they're testing their own features, they were getting slack because they subconsciously knew that a DOT was going to test it after them and catch whatever they'd missed. And so dotting, which was a tool that originally helped us build this quality mindset, was now holding the team back from progressing further. And so very carefully in selected teams, we started removing dotting completely. Now bear in mind there's still many unofficial points where a story can be rejected after it's marked done, so our rejection rates are still valid. But as far as the dev is concerned, they are the only person responsible for testing their feature, and they are the only person who sees the code before it goes to production. And so that's our current standard process in JIRA QA. All testing's done by the dev who implemented the feature, with advice and guidance from QA before and after implementation. And each dev holds full responsibility for the quality of what they write, all the way to production. Now please note that this is the current process. I don't label this as the final process. We're not done, and I don't think we'll ever be done. This is a snapshot of a process that's constantly evolving, constantly improving. But for our current crop of devs, for many of them, the reintegration process is complete. We've put the dev and test halves back through the transporter and reassembled them into whole engineers again. And along the way, I've been cured too. So I started off a suspicious and cynical QA engineer. But now I have a very high level of trust in our JIRA devs testing, and I would happily recommend them for any testing role in any other organisation. And so in practice, we actually do have 70 testers on the JIRA team. They're just the same 70 people as our developers. So if we're not testing, what's left for a quality assistance engineer to do all day? Well, first of all, we spend a lot of time with our devs. Each QA is responsible for 10 to 15 devs, and we work pretty closely with them. So we do QA demos, we review testing notes, we pair test with them on occasion, we show them new tools, we teach them good automation techniques, and we share knowledge. Basically, we do anything that we feel will help them become better testers and produce better software. Then there's experimentation. So you've now heard how our process is constantly changing. Now that doesn't happen naturally. It comes from QA engineers constantly pushing the boundaries of what we're doing. We're the ones responsible for coming up with new experiments, convincing teams to try them, making it happen, measuring the results and sharing the lessons. It can be really hard to push a team out of its complacency, especially when there's other business pressures at work. Our QA engineers need to be not only highly technical, but also good at working with people. We all know that if we're not constantly improving, we'll start going backwards. Then there's time spent getting to know our customers, what they want, what they need, where we're succeeding, and where we need to do better. And QA gets to build things too. We build testing tools, automation frameworks, knowledge sharing systems, defect analysis tools, and nothing's stopping us from committing to production either. I've shipped 3 JIRA features myself, and QA engineers have won our internal programming competitions quite a few times. In short, we take ownership of our teams. We don't have tasks, we have responsibilities to do whatever will help us solve problems, mitigate risks, and exploit opportunities to make things better. Better for our customers, better for ourselves, and better for the future. And so I'll leave you with the lessons that I've learnt the hard way over the past 5 years. So first is one that I really struggled with a lot, coming from an engineering background, which is that software quality is really about people, it's not about code. If you're in QA and all your efforts are bent towards improving the code, then the problems that you have today are still problems that you're going to have tomorrow. Whilst if you invest in improving people, building up a good culture and skills and mindset in the team, then today's problems won't exist tomorrow. Now, the second lesson is that improvement comes from questioning assumptions. You may find that some of the constants in your worldview may turn out to be as shaky as the things that I believed. So I believed that it was impossible for developers to be good testers. I was wrong. I'm glad to admit that I was wrong. So my unsolicited advice here is, if you can, take half an hour to sit down, write down your full development process and everything that goes into it. Write down some of the assumptions that are built into that process, and then take a hard look at those assumptions and see if there's anything there that isn't as solid as you think it is, anything that can be changed. The next lesson is to constantly experiment. Now, the process that I've described here is not a model to be rote applied to any team. I wouldn't apply it if I took on a new team now. It's a process of discovery that worked for one team in one company at one time. So I encourage you to experiment, fail, succeed, find what makes your team better and play with it. And make sure you have fun whilst you're doing it. So yes, we are always hiring in QA. So if you're a pro at exploratory testing and you can show us how you've improved quality by changing people, then we would absolutely love to hear from you.